In the quiet town of Maplewood, nestled deep in the woods, there was a legend whispered among the locals. They spoke of a presence that lurked in the shadows, a stalker with no face, no name. It was said that if you ever found yourself alone in the woods at night, you might feel its chilling presence, watching, waiting. Mark had heard these stories growing up, but like many, he dismissed them as mere superstition. That is, until one fateful night when he decided to test his courage. His friends dared him to spend the night in the woods, a rite of passage, they said, a way to prove he wasn't afraid. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees, Mark ventured into the forest. The crunch of leaves beneath his feet echoed through the silent woods, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. But he pushed the unease aside, determined to prove himself. Hours passed, and the woods grew darker, the trees looming like giants in the night. Mark huddled by a small campfire he had managed to start, the flames casting dancing shadows around him. That's when he heard it, a rustling in the bushes nearby. His heart pounding, Mark strained his eyes to see through the darkness. Was it just a small animal, or something more sinister? The rustling grew closer, and he could now make out a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. But there was something off about him, something unsettling. His features were twisted in a grotesque grin, and his eyes gleamed with malice in the firelight. Mark's blood ran cold as the man stepped closer, his footsteps deliberate and slow. "Who are you?" Mark managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer, instead continuing his slow advance. Panic set in as Mark realized there was no one around to help him. His friends were miles away, and he was alone with this deranged stranger in the heart of the woods. Desperation flooded through him as he scrambled to his feet, backing away from the advancing figure. But no matter how fast he ran, the man seemed to match his pace effortlessly, always just a few steps behind. It was then that Mark noticed something even more chilling. The man wasn't making a sound. No crunch of leaves beneath his feet, no heavy breathing from the pursuit. It was as if he floated through the woods, an otherworldly specter bent on Mark's destruction. With every passing moment, the terror grew, the feeling of being hunted consuming him. He could almost feel the man's hot breath on his neck, could almost taste the fear in the air. In a last-ditch effort, Mark veered off the path, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of trees. But the man stayed right on his heels, his presence a suffocating weight on Mark's shoulders. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, Mark burst into a small clearing. Gasping for breath, he turned to face his stalker, ready to confront whatever horror awaited him. But to his utter disbelief, the clearing was empty. There was no sign of the man, no trace of his chilling grin or malevolent gaze. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Shaken to his core, Mark stumbled out of the woods, his mind reeling with fear and confusion. When he finally reached the safety of his home, he collapsed on the doorstep, vowing never to return to those haunted woods again. To this day, Mark refuses to speak of that night, haunted by the memory of the unseen stalker that hunted him through the darkness. And though the townspeople still whisper of the legend, none dare to venture into the woods alone, lest they become the next victim of the faceless terror that lurks within. The city hummed with its usual rhythm as twilight settled over the urban sprawl. Sarah hurried down the dimly lit street, her footsteps echoing off the brick walls. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, a shiver running down her spine for no discernible reason. Maybe it was the stories she'd heard, whispered tales of stalkers lurking in the shadows. She quickened her pace, the click of her heels on the pavement growing louder in her ears. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance around her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned a corner, hoping to find solace in the familiar route home. But as she walked, a creeping sensation crawled up her neck, the feeling of being watched. She cast furtive glances around, but the street appeared empty, devoid of life except for herself. Rationality warred with instinct, and she forced herself to continue, chiding herself for being paranoid. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. A rustle behind her made her spin around, her breath catching in her throat. Was someone there? Or just the wind playing tricks? "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer came, except for the echo of her own voice bouncing off the buildings. Heart racing, she picked up her pace, the staccato rhythm of her steps echoing her rising panic. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure, every flickering light a potential threat. Finally, she reached her building, relief flooding her as she fumbled for her keys. The lock clicked open, and she hurried inside, the door slamming shut behind her. Leaning against it, she tried to steady her breathing, berating herself for letting her imagination run wild. But then she noticed something out of place. A small slip of paper lay on the floor as if it had been slipped under the door. Heart pounding, she picked it up, hands shaking as she unfolded it. "I see you," was all it said, scrawled in jagged letters that seemed to leer up at her. Dread settled like a stone in her stomach as she realized the full weight of those words. Someone had been following her, watching her every move. Panic set in as she scanned the empty apartment, the shadows now seeming to hold malicious intent. She checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. Whoever had left the note was gone, leaving only fear in their wake. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the old building sent her heart racing, every shadow morphing into sinister shapes in her mind. She lay in bed, clutching the covers to her chin, eyes wide and staring into the darkness. Then, a sound broke the silence. A soft scraping, like a window being opened. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she listened, paralyzed with fear. Another noise followed, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on hardwood floors. Terror seized her as she realized the intruder was inside her home. Every horror story she'd ever heard flooded her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She wanted to scream, to run, but fear rooted her to the spot. The footsteps grew closer, coming down the hallway toward her room. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She knew she had to do something, but her body refused to obey. And then, the door creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted in the darkness. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she saw the glint of eyes reflecting what little light there was. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. The figure stepped forward, its features still obscured by shadows. It spoke in a voice that sent shivers down her spine, a voice filled with malice and intent. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah," it whispered, the words slithering into her ears. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah finally found her voice, screaming for help as loud as she could. The figure lunged forward, and she scrambled out of bed, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She raced for the door, throwing it open and fleeing into the hallway. Behind her, she could hear the figure giving chase, its footsteps thundering behind her. She ran as if her life depended on it, taking stairs 2 at a time as she descended to the ground floor. Finally, she burst out into the street, tears streaming down her face as she sprinted for help. Lights flickered on in neighboring apartments as she pounded on doors, begging for someone to let her in. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone, leaving no trace behind. They took her statement, but without any evidence, there was little they could do. Sarah was left to wonder if it had all been a nightmare, a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. Someone had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as she huddled in her neighbor's living room, safe but shaken, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to haunt her nightmares. In the heart of a small, sleepy town nestled in the shadow of towering pines, there lived a young woman named Emma. She had just moved into an old, creaky house on the outskirts, seeking solace from the bustle of city life. Little did she know, the tranquility she craved would soon be shattered by a relentless terror that lurked in the darkness. It started innocently enough. Emma would notice small things out of place. A flower pot overturned on the porch, a chair moved from its usual spot in the garden. At first, she brushed it off as the wind or her own forgetfulness. But then the signs grew more sinister. One chilly evening, as she sat by the fireplace, a draft sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced up to see the curtains billowing, even though the windows were shut tight. Her heart quickened as she realized she was not alone. Someone was watching her. Fear crawled up her spine like 1,000 tiny spiders as she scanned the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. Nothing. Just the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emma convinced herself it was her imagination playing tricks on her, a result of the unfamiliarity of her new home. But the incidents only escalated from there. Every night, she would hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, just on the edge of perception. When she would investigate, the house would fall silent, mocking her fears with its empty rooms and deserted corners. Emma's nerves frayed with each passing day. She started to avoid going out after dark, locking herself inside the safety of her home. Yet, even in the daylight, the feeling of being watched never left her. It was as though a pair of unseen eyes followed her every move, waiting, watching. One stormy night, when the rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the very foundations of the house, Emma awoke to a sound that froze her blood. It was the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the old floorboards, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer to her bedroom door. She lay there, paralyzed with terror, as the footsteps paused right outside. Through the darkness, she could sense a presence looming, malevolent and hungry. A voice, soft as silk but cold as ice, whispered her name. Emma. She wanted to scream, to run, but fear had locked her muscles in place. The voice spoke again, closer this time, as if the owner of it was standing right beside her bed. You can't hide from me, Emma. I see you. A hand, icy and clammy, brushed against her cheek, and she recoiled, her mind reeling in horror. In a burst of desperate courage, she lunged for the lamp on her bedside table, flooding the room with light. But there was no one there. Only the empty room, the storm raging outside, and the echo of that chilling voice lingering in the air. Emma knew then that she was not dealing with a mere intruder or a figment of her imagination. Something sinister had latched onto her, something not of this world. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma delved into the history of her house, unearthing dark secrets that had been buried for decades. She learned of a previous occupant, a man consumed by jealousy and madness who had met a tragic end within these very walls. As she pieced together the fragments of the past, Emma realized that the spirit of this tormented soul was now fixated on her. It craved her fear, feeding on her terror like a moth to flame. And unless she could find a way to break free from its grip, she would be doomed to join him in his eternal torment. With a newfound resolve, Emma sought out help from a local medium, a woman rumored to have a gift for communing with the spirits. Together, they performed a ritual to cleanse the house of its dark presence, calling upon the forces of light to banish the malevolent spirit once and for all. As the last incantation was spoken, a chilling wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. For a moment, all was still. Then, slowly, the oppressive weight lifted, and Emma felt a sense of peace wash over her. When she dared to open her eyes, she found herself alone in the room. The spirit was gone, its hold broken by the power of their ritual. Exhausted but victorious, Emma knew she could finally rest easy. But as she drifted off to sleep, a whisper echoed in her mind, a final farewell from the spirit that had haunted her. Until we meet again, Emma. And though the house was now silent, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows, it was watching, waiting for another chance to claim her soul.